Hey there, and welcome to this week's episode. I have got a special guest here for you today, and I've only just met him, but he's got such a genuine, kind vibe to him. So I know you're going to love this interview. Let me tell you a little bit about him. So Ron Souers is a strengths coach, ADHD advocate, and he's the host of the podcast, Don't Mind Me, I Just Have ADHD. With a warm blend of honesty, humor, and fierce kindness, Ron shares his own journey through ADHD, depression, and late diagnosis to help others feel seen and less alone. Through storytelling, coaching, and conversation, he creates spaces for men, especially those over 40, navigating ADHD, addiction, or emotional disconnection to reconnect with themselves and others. His mission is simple: to help people say what they really need so they can finally get the support, healing, and connection that they deserve. Ron, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm flattered and honored that you'd see, that you're so kind with those those words. I definitely
Welcome.
appreciate that.
You're welcome. Yeah. So tell me your story. You've got quite the mission. ADHD, diagnosis later in life, and then so tell me, how did this all come about for you?
So yeah, and it wasn't like a straight path. It was, it really started in I would say like how I found out about my addiction was like, I was like living at home. I was homeless for the second time in DC. I don't know if you know about the National Mall, but I actually like that was where I like pretty much found myself sleeping outside, and I was like, I can't do this anymore. So that started my path towards getting the help that I really needed, and admitting that I had a problem with drugs. And now it's been almost 6 years, but like along that journey, which I needed to just see like that I needed even more help than just stopping the drugs. Like I needed some actual mental help. And I was about to lose my job because I kept breaking stuff and hurting myself and damaging company property. And I was just afraid of losing my job. And people kept telling me I need to slow down. You need to slow down. And I was like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. I'm not going fast enough. And, finally I was in a position to listen, and I went to my primary care, and I was like, I was just desperate for help. I was like, I can't slow down. I don't know what to do. And, I basically had to, guide her by the hand to say, hey, maybe I've got ADHD or whatever that is. And she was like, yeah, I can hook you up with these. She gave me a list of all these numbers to call. And of course, I'm like, I needed the help last week or last year. And, it was a whole process. But I finally was able to find the therapist that I actually am seeing today, and that journey was one of, it's even having that information, it was still confusing. He did help me a lot in the beginning to just be able to slow down, and giving me specific instructions on how to do that, and techniques. And one of the things that I remember him saying was like, this can actually be a strength, and I was like, I'm broken. Like this doesn't, that does, I didn't see that, so, I just continued to, I ended up leaving that thinking I was good, and then ended up almost getting fired again. And, I was like, I went back, and I was actually seeing him at the time because I was driving a fork truck, damaging company property again. Like this company is the same company has just put up with me. And, I ended up having to step down from that role. And, that was very humbling for me because, I didn't know how other people would react to that. There was a lot of like debt issues, and I didn't know how I was going to pay that. So I started looking into other ways to make money, and I ended up getting into podcasting and learning a lot about who I am and like how ADHD isn't really the problem. It's just actually just a different operating system. And, started to talk about that with my coworkers and be more open about that. And, I thought, hey, like I could coach this, I've seen a lot, like that's usually the transition for a lot of people with podcasts. And, I started to really understand like being more pro-social was such an empowering thing for me, especially with ADHD and being an introvert, going out there and trying to talk to people that I've never met about, deep things, things that I struggled with. And was so scary. But at the same time, like once I've got through that barrier, it just now I want to go and talk to more people. I love talking to people. It's incredible.
Tell me, there's something that you said earlier about, you didn't say use the word rushing, but like moving too fast.
Yeah.
And that's something to do with ADHD. And, so there's going to be people who listen to this who, of course, they've heard about ADD, they've heard about ADHD, but maybe they don't understand about this moving too fast thing and ADHD and the wiring. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So yeah, and not everybody who has ADHD has, is moves too fast or gets distracted, or there's a whole spectrum. There's like inattentive, and then there's hyperactive, and then there's the combination. So I'm sure that I'm on the combination. So it shows up as, especially with going too fast, as like that impulsivity. And I was always like given, like people, especially people that were trying to help me told me that I'm impulsive. And I didn't understand like what that meant. It just means like there's no filter, or there's nothing, there's no pause between like what comes in my mind or what comes out of my mouth or what I end up doing. And that what I've learned is actually a common thing for people with ADHD, because the part of our brain that most people have, or, quote unquote, normal people have, has been underdeveloped. And that's the executive function part of the brain. So the part that tells you, oh, you need to get up, or you need to plan for this, or you need to, set that doctor's appointment, or set a reminder for that, or you need to get up and go to work. That part of the brain isn't as developed as the emotional part of the brain. So whenever, I'm super emotional about something, or the emotions just override, like that part of the brain's like, it doesn't exist. It's not powerful enough to create that barrier that a lot more people have, like that they won't say things that come out of their mouth right away.
There's that saying, the space between stimulus and response, right? Like the more that
Yeah.
we can stretch that little space, the space between the idea or the trigger or something to what we do, that gives us that power. And if your executive functioning isn't as developed, then it's really challenging to make that space.
Yeah.
There was something else that you said. So there's this thing about, if you're super emotional, oftentimes you're triggered, right?
Yeah.
And then so that makes that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic portion of your brain, it makes it even smaller, right? So sure, awareness and knowledge is really, really helpful. But then you've taken it and gone from, homeless to actually thriving, right? So like there's
Yeah.
stuff that you've learned and courage that you've exercised to actually make that transition. Tell me about that.
Yeah, no, and it took a lot of humility and like a lot of mistakes. I continue to make mistakes, but the thing is, like, one of the biggest things that really helped me to really make that change is acceptance. Just that acceptance of like, first off, that I'm an addict on a deep level, like that. There's nothing I can do to change that. That's just who I am. That's part of who I, like what is the core of me. Because like, and when I say addict, like that just means like I can just get an idea or an obsession, and if I continue to be compulsive about that obsession, then there's nothing that I will throw everything away in my life just to get that. And I feel like the overlap between ADHD and addiction is so close, because it's also that like instant gratification. Like I need to have this done right now and nothing else matters. Like I don't feel like doing this because like I feel depressed, and having that acceptance and, in the beginning, it was like I would deny that I was depressed. There was a lot of pushing down these emotions, and once I started to have that acceptance and started to really just, and the way that it really connected with me was, having love for myself. So in these situations that, I'd get mad at work and, because somebody wasn't, doing the thing that I wanted them to do, or I needed to complete a task, and I had to wait for somebody else to get that task done. And me having like, I just see people as obstacles to getting what I needed, instead of seeing them as fellow human beings that are there. They're not doing this to make me mad. They're just doing this because like maybe they forgot, maybe they have ADHD too. Like, but I don't see that, I'm like, so when I started to love myself, and it said, like, it was like, I'm not going to get mad or upset, or I'm not going to allow that person to get me upset, because like I don't want to spend that energy getting upset, because I love myself enough. So I started having like a deeper level of love and acceptance for who I am, and, and then having that deeper level of acceptance of my ADHD, and like I would get distracted and I would, say, you idiot, like how could you do that? And like, the thing that really helped there was like, it, it's okay. I did that, just happened. That's part of like how my brain is. Like, I'm not going to change that. How can I like accept the limitations that I have so I can work within those, like because I feel like once I define those boundaries and limitations, that that everyone naturally has, like the more strong, like the more I was able to stick in my lane and, actually thrive in who I was becoming.
Super interesting. There's a place where you talked about addiction, and we know now that so much of addiction is a result of trauma, big T, small t trauma, whichever kind of trauma. I am no therapist,
Yeah.
so I don't know all the details. But you've got trauma, you've got addiction, and then you layer on this other wiring. It's like this kind of trifecta of something.
Mhm.
And, like in Western society, that can often be seen as a negative thing. But you
Yeah.
said earlier about a different wiring, a different processing system, and a different gift. Talk about that. Like how does it become a gift? What is the gift here?
So yeah, and that's part of some of the work that I've done is, so it's called mindfulness, which led to me actually getting, a certification in MBSP, which is mindfulness based strength practice. So that's it's combining character strengths and mindfulness to create this almost like superpower mindfulness
Mhm.
technique. So when you look at ADHD, a lot of people see it as that negative, like he's broken, like his life's over, like everything's going to be hard for him or her. And honestly, when you start to switch that up, because we all have like these strengths, these character strengths, like it could be forgiveness, it could be creativity, it could be self regulation, and when you start to like focus on those things, which, because it's a lot of therapy is focusing on the negatives and how can we change those. A lot of society is, like, what didn't you do that they did? It's like you didn't live up to the standard that no one can live up to. So it's about looking at that, and within ADHD there's that creativity, there's that perseverance, there's that, able to think outside the box. And when you're talking about, companies, 'cause that's why I focus on, the workspace in my podcast, and, a lot of the stuff that I'm trying to develop in the coaching aspect is like, when you start to see that, is like, okay, if you have somebody that can think outside the box and with a creative solution to something, like that's an asset to your team that you're not taking advantage of, because you're just over here looking at like all the negative behavior and
Mhm.
not trying to understand that, hey, maybe that person isn't doing that to like be weird, to be like outside the box. Maybe they can't help themselves. Like I couldn't help slowing down. I didn't think I had a problem with it. I didn't know how to like how to manage that. And I didn't have anybody in my life to tell me that was like in a constructive way, that was not a good way to live. So that with the mindfulness is like being able to have like that space that you were talking about earlier. Like that space for me is like was such a gift that like when I first found mindfulness, I was like, wow, like that space, it's like we don't have enough room as people in general, but like people with ADHD that are going 100 miles an hour, like we don't have enough room to question the narratives that we're telling ourselves, that these things may not be true. So being able to slow down and create that space, which is one of the hardest things to do for us. But once we're able to do that, like I feel like because we're so sensitive emotionally, we get so much more out of it.
Talk a bit more about this, being more sensitive emotionally than, maybe the average normie. What's the gift? What's the gift in that, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. And like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist or anything. This is just research that I've done on my own that makes sense, because I've read books about sensitivity, and then it connected later with this Dr. Gabor Mate and how he talks about the development of the brain. Especially with trauma and stress early on, it gets affected. Like other parts of the brain aren't developed, but the brain will develop other parts more. So I believe that these sensitive people, which is termed as neurodivergence, just have parts of their brain are more developed than other parts, so that sensitivity to emotions and like that, you can show up as a better person in relationships once you understand like how to navigate those emotions. Like when you have emotional intelligence, which a lot of we aren't taught that as a society, like we're taught to these emotions aren't needed, they aren't necessary, we need to push them down, we need to ignore them, like especially ones like anger and sadness and depression. Like they don't talk about these things, especially men, and you see the suicide rate because men can't talk about their feelings because they don't want to have that perception like they're weak. And I know this because like I used to want to, they would say, "Oh, you're too sensitive," and I would just laugh it off and, try to act harder. But that whole mask was exhausting. I feel, and it's still there to a degree, depending on the situation. But I like you've seen, I'm very vulnerable when it comes to like how I'm feeling, even with new people, because I know who I am, and I'm confident in like what I've gotten from saying like, I've said to other men, I feel sad today, like, and that was weird at first. It was like, it just came out like that's not even something you're supposed to say as a man. Like, this is like, okay, on to the next thing. Like that shouldn't have been said, but it's like, I needed to feel that sadness, and I've still got like decades of sadness inside of me that's like been pushed down, and that what that does is it blocks these other emotions like anger. So when I start to let that, let myself feel that, like I've noticed that this anger came up, and this frustration. I'm like, I've gotten better with it, but it's like I'll never get to the core of like who I am and being able to show up as the person that I need to be if I have these repressed emotions that I'm not allowing myself to feel.
Yeah, and it's not just the harder emotions, So I've people have explained it to me. If you think of your emotions like as a sine wave, right? So if you don't let yourself experience the sad, mad, depressed stuff, and then you also can't experience joy, right? So
Yeah.
everything is, then you're stuck in this little teeny tiny bandwidth of what you're allowed to experience. And life gets pretty dull and pretty like bland and meh when you
Yeah.
don't allow yourself to experience emotions. I'm using this app that I found and I love it. And
Yeah.
it's called, let me just tell you what it's called, How We Feel. And
Yeah.
it's a really fun app because you just log in It's how am I feeling? What's going on right now? And then it sort of helps you to catalog how you're feeling. Where are you on the spectrum? What do you feel more often than others? And because you get so many different words to express these different emotions, you get a much better emotional vocabulary, right? So it's like, do I
Yeah.
feel dread or do I feel anguished? Or like which is the emotion that I'm feeling here? And you have to kind of think about it. And then the best part is that as you're logging the emotion, whether it's good or bad or in between, as you're thinking about what is it that I'm feeling right now, it shifts. And it's like, oh, I don't feel that anymore.
Yeah.
I'm feeling something new, right? So you can really see how fast your emotions change. And I find that just fascinating.
Yeah, because emotions are there to tell you things. They're, and if we're ignoring them, it creates this person or this path that you don't want to be on. I've noticed, like, because I'm in touch with my emotions, like, I noticed that what my ambitions are and what my dreams are and how I align my life with that is based upon how my emotions are in that moment. And I get to use other things, like that's where the mindfulness and the character strengths come in, because I'm using, curiosity to explore that emotion, where that's coming from. And oftentimes, sometimes it leads nowhere, but a lot of times it'll draw back to, like, well, this is connected to something in my childhood, some
Right.
trauma that I experienced. And it keeps playing out. Like, why am I getting upset when somebody says something to me, or when somebody yells at me, or talks down to me? Because, like, that triggers something in me that happened with my father, and it brings me back to that little boy that feels like unloved, that was never enough, that was never, he was never proud of. So I'm like, oh, okay. Not that I'm saying that it's right for me to like say those things, but now I'm like, I get a deeper understanding of, like, okay, this is why I get so mad in those situations. So the next time that it happens, it's not as visceral. It's not as, like, where I'm about to, like, quit my job, or I'm about to throw down. I can breathe, go through that, explore it, instead of just reacting and potentially losing my job.
And every other aspect of your life, right? To have
Yeah.
that, so that it really comes back to this learning a tool to make that space between what's going on, the stimulus, and how you respond. And sometimes the
Yeah.
how you respond is in the emotion as well. So, and then to stay there just long enough to get a little bit curious, right?
Yeah.
And then that gives you power. Like, that's the
Yeah.
magic right there.
Yeah, and then you can talk about that emotion. Once you've, especially for me, I've asked myself two questions whenever I'm feeling. I was like, or I have two boundaries, or like stipulations before I talk about an emotion. Like, I can't be in that emotion. And then I got to ask myself, is this something that I can live with moving forward? Is this something that should be triggering me? Or is it something, and sometimes I've got to talk with somebody else about it. That's why it's huge to be able to be vulnerable, because, like, a lot of the times I'm like, well, I can't talk about this, or I can't talk about, like, maybe I sent this girl a text and she's not responding to me, so I got to bury that as, like, a loss. But I could actually, express that with a good friend and say, hey, this is what happened. This is the text I sent. She kind of ghosted me. Like, after this, what do you think? Do you think this was weird? Like, I should have sent it, and then, like, that creates, like, a lot of times it's like, no. And, like, maybe they give you a good response to get that conversation back, instead of just being like, I'm just going to take that as a hit to my self esteem, a hit to my ego. And I'm going to bury that because, like, I don't want to risk somebody else seeing me the way that I'm viewing myself in the moment.
Yeah. And it's also, to me, it's the perspective that the other person helps you see, right? Like, it's like that happened
Yeah.
and this is how I think and feel about it. But is there another explanation, right? Like, is there another explanation that
Mm-hmm.
is just as true? And as soon as you can see that your thought isn't necessarily true, then you're like, oh, I never thought about it. I can get a new perspective, right? Like I was just talking to
Yeah.
a client, and she was saying, when she was younger, for 2 years, she tried out for the soccer team. And both years, they were like, no, but come back next year and try again. And we were talking about how
Yeah.
that turns into a story. And she said that originally for her, the story was, I'm not good enough, right? I'm not good enough to do that. And I said, but
Mhm.
you could have, with another perspective, thought that the story was, they think I have potential. I just need to go and practice more and come back again next year, right? So instead of turning it into a thing
Yeah.
about your self-worth, it's a thing about your skills, and that underneath there is potential that you can improve and try again, keep trying, come back, right? And it's just that slightly different interpretation can make such a difference to how we process and how we live our life.
Yeah, definitely. It's all about perspective. That's the one of the biggest things that's helped me is like it goes back to the narratives that we tell each other, that what we tell ourselves, and those narratives will keep going on. Especially if we don't have something to challenge them, or if we don't have somebody in our life that we can be vulnerable with, or
Mm,
multiple people. The more people that you can run that by, and that's all about like teamwork and community and developing these relationships that cultivate you as a person. So when you're not showing up in your best, you're not being who you really are normal. Those people don't see you for that. They can be there for you in that moment because we all need that. We all need that at some point, no matter how strong or we think or we show that we are.
agreed. Agreed. Well, Ron, it was been a great conversation. I
Yeah.
loved all the different directions that we did. Can you share with us how people can find out more about you?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I'm offering your audience a free my self discovery journal for adults with ADHD. You can find that at on the top of my website. It's your ADHDguy.com. It's a great resource for going deeper into those emotional trauma, questions. And it continues to go deeper, and you can take your time with it. Also, if you like,
Just wait. Just wait. We're going to do that again. Okay. So, Ron, it's been such an interesting conversation. Can you tell the listeners how they can find out more about you?
yeah, thank you. I'm offering your guest as a gift, my free self-discovery journal for adults with ADHD. And that has some great prompts in it for questions if you want to go deeper with that emotional trauma that we were talking about earlier. You can find that at youradhdguy.com. And if you love what you hear and you're a guy that's over 40, you're dealing with addiction, ADHD, or depression, you can always book a free self-discovery call with me at that same website, youradhdguy.com. If you love just hearing my voice and nice tips and the way I advocate, you can also find me on my podcast. Don't mind me. I just have ADHD on your whatever platform is your favorite one.
And I'll make sure to put all the links in the episode notes as well. Ron, I've really appreciated having you as a guest. I learned a lot. I appreciate hearing your story as well. It gives it that human side instead of it just being
Yeah.
a bunch of facts and science. And I thank you. I thank you for joining me.
Yeah. And you as well. Thank you for having me. Again, I'm honored and flattered.
Okay, everyone, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'll put all of Ron's data and his links in the episode notes, so make sure to check him out. Have a great day.